Awesome. Welcome everyone back to the SVK network. So I am like through the moon on this next topic and who we have on the show today. And really, I'm calling it the Restaurant Business Show. And thank you for everyone that messaged me about the spelling on our ad. Jim, I don't know if you noticed that. But that's what happens when you do things at 2 a.m. Those things happen. But anyways, thank you for everyone that corrected the spelling error. So on that, we are stoked today to have Jim from Benchmark 60 back in here to really help us talk about the business side of our industry. And really, I love how you look at things, Jim. And first of all, welcome to our show today.
Thanks. It's good to be back.
It's good to be back, eh? It's been
good to be back.
It's good. It's going to be amazing. This is going to be amazing talk. So we're going to talk about folks today. But before we get into the topic today around restaurant budgeting, because there's a lot there. And obviously you can send us comments. You can ask Jim during the show live. We'll have the comments come up here and we can hopefully get to some of those questions. But if not, you can watch our shows. We're daily. We're the only food service daily show in North America, actually, I think on this planet as well, that we're live every day, Monday to Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And also you can rewatch our shows at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So if you missed today's show, you can watch it tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern time. And then on the weekend on my own channel on LinkedIn, we rebroadcast in the morning. So anyways, and also make sure you subscribe to our channels over at Sysco Canada, get notified when we go live and all these great things. So, but anyways, Jim, let's talk restaurant business.
Yeah,
what we're going to talk about before we throw a commercial. But we're going to talk about today about restaurant business. What's going out there in the budget world in our industry, Jim?
Well, it's funny how, September 1st comes around and immediately everybody starts thinking about that, right? The craze of summer is, comes to a screeching halt and everybody goes, first of all, what's going to happen in the fall? What's going to happen to my revenue and my profit and all that kind of stuff. But, immediately they start thinking Q4, they start thinking budgeting, they start thinking what's going to happen for next year. And, there's just so much unpredictability in our industry these last couple of years that I think it's heightened this year compared to even some of the past years because everybody's just trying to figure out, how to plan.
Now I see that as well. And I think overall in the industry, you kind of see that I always call it like you float through the summer rocking it. And then people go back to school and it's like, oh, what's going on here? Where'd all the crowds go?
Yeah.
Right. But now let's render a quick commercial. Let's come back because then all the viewers and everyone else are going to be watching our show today or listening to it later. Because you can watch on demand. You can binge watch 300 shows that we have on YouTube if you like. Way back into the day. You can actually see Jim there when he was young, way back in our first episodes. But you can watch our show on Spotify as well. Listen to it on Spotify or podcast or whatever you want. But let's throw a commercial. Let's come back because I get like a list of questions, Jim.
Sounds good.
On budgets and what we can do to help this industry out in this weird, crazy fall time coming up here. But let's run a quick commercial and be right back. Here we go. Welcome back, everyone, to Sysco Virtual Kitchen. You know, Jim, we're talking budgets, restaurant budgets right now. We got a ton here of questions and different things that we're going to ask around. But Jim, okay, let's get into the basis of budgeting here in
Mhm.
restaurants. When do most restaurants do they do a calendar year, January usually, or is it September now that people start budgeting?
I find in my experience, most of them are doing calendar year. I mean, some have a fiscal year that ends,
Does that
November,
matter?
that
Does it
kind of thing.
matter? I never
It
asked that
doesn't.
question. Does it matter?
It
No, it
doesn't
doesn't.
really matter. No. I mean, as long as we're consistent, compare apples to apples every year, it doesn't matter. If all of a sudden they decided to switch, it might throw a bit of a wrench in things. But I think a lot of the discussion happening now is not so much when to budget, but how. Right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah. Like, what's
inflation's
the
at
first step?
almost record high. We've
Yeah.
got cost of goods is out the window. Wages are different. You can't even hire enough people to generate the revenue you used to do in some cases. What's going to happen with the uncertainty of seasonal change and that kind of thing. So it's a really a big question mark right now in the industry for sure.
So if you're going to a restaurant right now to help out and to work on these said budgets, what is some of the first steps that you look at? Because you look at things differently, and everyone you got to check out. First of all, here's a little plug for Jim: is check out Jim benchmark60.com.ca
.com.
.com. Check it out because Jim. This is why we love Jim in this industry, and this is why Jim's huge in the industry now. He sees things differently than anything else out there. So check it out. Anyways, there's a plug for you. But what's the first step? You go in a restaurant. First step that you're doing with a restaurant on budgeting. What is it?
Well, traditionally, restaurants, in my experience at least, when they write budgets, they start with revenue first, right? And then they try to make sure that all of the percentages line up to the point where they get a profit margin that they're happy with, or that doesn't cause them to maybe lose so much sleep at night. And we try to actually break down in a lot more detail, in a more holistic way, what's happening with the business in terms of not only trend, but what those trends are telling us will likely happen. So things like customer count and customer behavior are far more important to writing budgets that are accurate than just looking at
I'm
revenue.
sorry, Jim. You know I'm going to interrupt you.
Sure.
But so it's what comes. Traffic. Okay, you said. Okay, go back to that. What you just said there.
Customer count and customer behavior is the number one
Behavior
thing that we look at.
You look at customer behavior in relationship to a budget.
Right. So the other way to the other term we could use for customer behavior is how does customer spend? How does the customer spend money in your restaurant?
That's huge.
And
See, look at things differently.
Traditionally, looking at operations, there's always these, let's run a sales contest, or let's see who can sell the most bottles of wine, or let's run a promotion to try to generate revenue, right? But it's less than 10% swing one way or another that typically those contests or those different things actually, they really don't make that much of a change. It's typically less than 10%.
I remember the wine thing. I did the wine thing.
Mm-hmm. So
10, that doesn't even move at 10.
We all did the wine thing. Who can sell the most bottles of wine? Well, did you notice when you did that contest that it was always the same person that won? They loved that contest. They took home a bottle of that wine every night, right? But the people who naturally weren't good at sales, or the people who naturally or maybe just didn't buy into the idea that they were going to be in a competition that night, they never won the contest. They never sold any more wine. They never did any of those things. So it actually really moved the needle very little. And things like time of year, weather, day of the week, seasonality, those things affect customer behavior on larger scale far more than any of those little promotions ever do.
Now, you're telling me that you actually incorporate weather into a budget too?
Absolutely. If you think about what happens when the weather gets nicer and the weather gets warmer, I mean, you live in Edmonton, right? So it's like extremes. But when it gets warmer, what happens to how customers behave in a market like Edmonton? They go out more often. They sit on the patio. They drink more. The average spend changes dramatically in a city like Edmonton, or in most Canadian cities, from January, February, even March to what happens in summertime. And heading into this time of year, it's even more dramatic when you look at what happens in December versus what happens in January, right?
Okay,
what happens in December? More people go out and spend more money.
So how do you factor that into? Do you look at forecasts? Like, I'm gonna have some pretty silly questions here.
Sure.
But do you look at that, the weather forecast, or what they're predicting? Farmers Almanac? What do you do?
Well, some of it day to day is tough to predict, right? But if you think seasonal weather, I mean, it definitely impacts on a larger scale what's happening in terms of how your customers are going to behave. And if you think about that just in terms of December versus January, part of that's weather, part of it's seasonal, part of it's events. It's just those are all pieces of the big puzzle. But in December, people go out more often traditionally, and they typically spend more per person. And in January, they go out less and they typically spend less. So it's really important to look at more than just what the revenue number is for each month when you're trying to write a whole budget for the business.
That's really interesting. How many restaurants do you find that you meet with that actually incorporate the weather?
Not very many.
I was going to say.
They think about things like how busy are we going to be around Christmas, or how busy are we going to be in the summer, or how slow are we going to be in January? Jeez. But they typically think about it from a revenue perspective, not so much from a customer count or customer behavior perspective.
Okay, so how do you factor in customer behavior now? Like,
well,
is that based on weather, or is it based on there's so many things here, Jim, that's huge.
Yeah, the customer behavior that's the term that we use for things like customer spend, right? Like I said, they go out more, they spend more in December. They go out less, they spend less in January. We call that behavior because if you actually, what we were saying a minute ago, all of those sales contests and promotions that restaurants run, they don't actually move the needle as much as things like seasonality do for customer behavior. And sometimes we actually find that the promotions that are being run by restaurants that might drive traffic actually hurt the way they actually discourage the customer from behaving the way we want them to, and can actually make the business less profitable.
Okay, so you're saying if we budget certain ways, it can actually drive the behavior of what people come into our restaurant like?
Absolutely. So if we don't look at that in a holistic way and really make sure that we understand what's happening with how a promotion causes the customer to behave, then sometimes we can actually cannibalize what's happening in the business. And if we don't understand that properly, budgeting for those types of things becomes even harder. So customer behavior, like we said a few minutes ago, is actually the first thing that we look at when we're going to write budgets with restaurants.
Really? So what do restaurants think when you bring this up and you consult with them?
They typically, one of two ways. They either are, interested in a different way of looking at things. And, that's typically the type of restaurant operator that we work with is an operator that wants to start looking at things differently. But quite often there's this sort of, we've always done it this way attitude, and sort of, our industry's kind of stuck in that. So, there's usually some really good discussion and being able to show an operator exactly what we mean when we look at this more holistically. There's usually some pretty good eye-opening things that happen really quickly for customers. We had an example of working with a couple of restaurant operators that had the same business model in two different markets. Same concept, same menu, same pricing strategy, same wages.
This is normal. This is normal too, right?
Pardon me?
This is typical. This would be
very,
right? Okay.
Very typical.
Okay, keep going.
What we found was that these two almost identical businesses, in terms of how they looked, how they felt, staffing numbers, seat count, all of those things, both of them operating with good management and all that kind of thing. However, one of them just for some reason was 2 to 3 percentage points less profitable than the other. Okay. So, one of them's making money and one of them's really having a tough time. And there was starting to be some discussion about whether or not this was a management issue or something else. And so we peeled back some of these layers and looked at things like customer behavior and some of the forecasting that was happening and that kind of thing, and found that literally there was one difference between the two businesses. That one difference was that they were running happy hour 7 days a week in both locations. One location just happened to be 6 blocks away from an arena where the sporting events are. So what we actually were able to identify really quickly in about 30 seconds was that they were actually altering the customer's behavior in a way that was hurting the business, because they were going to be full anyway. And now they're giving a discount when they didn't need to.
Wow.
So, basically what that conversation led to really quickly was this happy hour program. If there's an opportunity to change it on event nights in the space that's 6 blocks away, it would actually dramatically increase their customer spend on those days where there was events, bring them right back up to where the other location was in terms of overall customer behavior. And they were able to add 2 to 3 points to their profitability, like literally overnight without changing the operation.
Serious. So how, because that must happen a lot that we don't look at the other things around the business that are factoring and like businesses that are doing things outside. And probably some are, but I'm sure there's a lot that are not aware of those certain things and they're giving away the farm or like as everyone says, leaving money on the table. But I think there is definitely some opportunities when you look at that. Now, when you look at budgeting, when you're working on a budget, let's say with a client, do you look at almost like a week by week, or do you day by day, or how do you look at that within the whole overall year? Do you go day by day and then you pin out those, like it's a holiday this week?
We can get day by day with certain line items, right? I mean, I would never encourage a restaurant operator to try to get day by day on the whole budget. I mean, there's certain things in there that are monthly expenses and that kind of stuff that we would always encourage them to have a rolling monthly budget that we can adjust, on the fly. That's quick. But things like labor cost and cost of goods, we can definitely get down to the point where we're budgeting them daily.
Daily, right?
And really looking at things beyond just what the percentage of revenue is. Things like contribution for cost of goods and productivity and workload for employee workload for labor cost that are actual strategies instead of results that'll help them actually achieve what they want to get to.
How many restaurants move from that to a strategy in a sense of the budget dictating really what they're going to do within their strategy? How many shift that way, Jim?
This, in my personal experience, and this isn't trying to paint the whole industry with one brush, I'll be careful here, but, I think that our industry is notorious for being very reactive. And, we see so many operators that write a budget at the end of the fiscal year, whether that's, in the fall or in for January 1st, they write a budget that is a static budget that's going to last them the whole year. And for the first few months, if they did a good job, that's probably pretty accurate. And things kind of seem to go okay. But by the time, cost of goods starts to change, inflation, we've got wages that start to change. We've got, labor shortages or all these different things that get thrown at a restaurant at any given time. By the time you get halfway through the year, the unfortunate thing is that we see so much emotional reaction to that, emotional decision-making based on what's happening with the budget. So they might be way off and then they just start to react. And unfortunately that can cause some damaging decisions sometimes.
Yeah, I would imagine emotions are a factor when you see inflation going up and labor costs going up. Yeah, I can see that definitely impacting. So anyways, we're going to break for a quick commercial, folks. We're going to come back with Jim and this great topic. I got more questions here, Jim. And Jose sent in one here as well about online and colder seasons and stuff. That's another subject we can get into as well. But folks, we're going to be right back with, I'm not going to call you a legend because you guys get all your cranking and call you a legend. But we'll be back with Jim right after this quick message. Here we go. All right, welcome everyone back to SVK Network. We got Jim here from Benchmark 60, talking budgets, restaurant budgets. And what's some of the practices right now you see out in the field that you would not recommend people do, other than he said not including all the things we talked about. But what do you see? Top 3 things that you recommend people not maybe do or continue to do.
Top 3 things I would recommend people not do.
Yeah.
Well, number 1 would be, the budget definitely can't be a static budget for the year. Especially the way our industry operates now, has to be shorter term. If you have to do it in as long as possible, by the quarter maybe, but we definitely encourage month to month budgeting. Okay. Most of the heavy lifting of that gets done at the beginning, and it's just the big costs that we need to monitor more closely. But that's one. Excuse me. The comment from Jose there about online and how that affects, how seasonality affects online ordering and whatnot. One thing we see happening with that, online ordering can dramatically affect things like average customer spend, because so many of the POS systems out there, if someone orders a bunch of items online, DoorDash or Skip or whatever these platforms are, typically they show up in the POS as one customer that might be ordering $100 worth of food. And that, what I see people worrying about sometimes is that they're worried that inflates what their average customer spend looks like. So they remove that information from the overall equation. And they say, okay, this is what our business is doing. And, this is just the online stuff. But it's really important to understand that that's part of the total revenue package. That's part of the total business. That's part of what's actually creating, revenue and costs and all of those things. So it's really important to include it. So the second one would be, don't exclude any information. Make sure that it's really a holistic view of what's going on. And I think, don't overcomplicate it, right? We've seen, lots of companies that they start their budgeting process September 1st and it's barely done by January.
Serious.
Right? I mean, some of them, it takes so long. There's multiple drafts and all this kind of stuff. What I would actually encourage restaurants to do, and this might sound counterintuitive, but do it as quickly as you possibly can, because there's so much variation and so much change in what's happening with, wages and costs and all these things in the restaurant, that if you start writing your budget in September, by the time you actually finish it in January, that stuff's changed.
Well, I think that's a great point, because I think people that budget in January this year, because it's probably, the quiet months of January, I'm going to write down my budget for the year, probably didn't factor in the amount of inflation on food right now that we're dealing with in the industry, right? Mm-hmm. So their budget would be like, wouldn't even be close to what they're budgeting for, right?
Wouldn't be. And then typically the emotional reactions start to come in, and they see these changes in inflation, and they just raise their price, or something like that. So,
or what I usually see is they take it out of the marketing budget.
That too.
Yeah, they go, well, we don't need those ads or those things on social, or those advertisements. We'll take that away. And that's the worst thing to do, is to reduce your advertising when things are going downhill.
Yeah.
I do the opposite, right? So those 3 things you got to do. Now, I have a question regarding the budget. So how long does a budget take to make? Like, how many? You said September all the way to January. Not too long. How long does it take to sit down and crunch some numbers usually?
Well, I would say that a restaurant could write their budget in a day.
Okay.
I think that the restaurant business, as we all know, it's busy. There's lots going on. There's a million moving parts. No day is ever the same. So people are getting, the people who are responsible for writing these budgets are getting pulled in a bunch of different directions, right? But we typically, because we've got a good process and a way of looking at how to get this information together quickly, if we're doing a budget with a restaurant, we typically do it in one day. And, that's everything from looking at what the trends are to what some accurate forecasting would look like, what their customer behavior and count looks like, helping them with cost of goods. We typically can get that done in one day.
So Jim, you said trends there. What do you mean by trends? Like is that food trends or patterns? We talked about the pattern of people. We understand that. The weather, we got that. Mm-hmm. Trends. Is there food trends that we should be aware of as well that we got to look out for?
When I say trends, I mean more business trends in terms of how the business is currently operating. And that's part of the reason why we would suggest that you do it as quick as possible and as close to the time as possible, and update it frequently, because trends can change so much, right? Everything from what are the wages like that you're having to pay at this time? So what's that going to do to your labor cost? What's the cost of beef, the cost of oil? Those are going to change your cost of goods. So the trends that that I'm referring to are things like what's currently happening in the business now over the last 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks, so that we can make good decisions about what at least the next 4 weeks will look like.
Oh, now I have read in past that you don't need to budget. And I'm sure there's a lot of restaurants that don't budget anything to live. What is that? Okay, is that a problem or concern? Is that something that you recommend or not do? If you're not doing it, do it. Tell us more. What about that, Jim?
I would never recommend to not do that. I think that
Jim gave you the don't do it. Look,
don't do that. I think that there's certain things. If someone was adamant about that, I think that I could probably be convinced to meet in the middle somewhere on things like if you don't include how much it costs you to have your garbage picked up every week in your budget, that's fine. It's probably a contract that's fixed for the whole year, no problem. Okay. But if you're not budgeting for things like what the labor cost is going to look like, what the food and beverage cost is going to look like, what your profit margin may or may not look like depending on the time of year, if you're not having an idea and a forecast of what's happening with that, this is one of the things that I think our industry needs to improve on, because so many restaurants we talk to don't understand what happened with their margins until 2, 3, 4 weeks after it's already happened. Mm-hmm. So it's putting businesses in such a reactive state that they can never get ahead.
And that would be based on a lot of them just running blind, right? Like Absolutely. It's day-to-day practice. What's the benefits of a budget? What are some of those top things that if people aren't doing it, they're going to do it now? This is what you're going to see. I'm going to say probably at the end, I'm just answering myself, profit, better profits. But does it reduce stress, anxiety that we're all dealing with right now?
Yeah, I think if it's approached correctly, it may not guarantee that you're more profitable, but it at least helps to remove some of the misunderstanding about what's going on. If we're really accurate about what's happening with things like customer count, customer behavior, where the trends are in terms of cost of product, at least we're going in with an idea of what should happen, right? Okay. And then by the time we get to once it did happen, we can actually have a good way of being analytical and looking at what do we need to change to make sure that doesn't happen again. I was talking to an operator the other day. I asked them if their business is making money, and they said, I think so. There's money in the bank. And, that was a little bit scary to begin with. But when we asked them about what happens with their budgeting, they weren't doing any budgeting, and they weren't getting any results from their accountant until 6 weeks after the end of the month. So they weren't getting July's numbers until mid-September. And by that point,
it's
far too late.
It's too late if you're losing your shirt. Do you see that happen a lot? That people
all the time.
In that oh my God, that comes from that's scary.
Yeah.
But that comes from when you have a problem with your food costs and your labor costs, and you're looking out so far in advance. There's no way to correct it by the time it's too late.
Absolutely.
How many times that happened, Jim? Happen a lot?
Too many to count.
Too many to count?
Too many to count, for sure. It happens all the time.
So if we're telling people this happens too much, what do we do to correct that?
Well, and that's where, we spend a lot of time on this type of stuff. And typically where the first two sort of courses of action that we always take are, and this is probably no surprise to anybody, but are directly on what's happening with labor costs, what's happening with cost of goods, because those are your two biggest costs in your business, right? Sometimes up to 60 or 70% of the.
Has that changed, Jim? Has that went up? Sorry, jump in there.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, you hear all kinds of numbers from anywhere from 60 to 75, 80%, but it really depends on the business model, right? But if you don't know exactly what's happening with those things in almost real time, it's too late, right? Okay. So we typically try to take a really holistic, data-driven approach at looking at those two costs and making sure that in almost in real time, the operator can tell exactly what's going on so that they can react quickly.
Wow. Is there good tools to use out there, Jim, or do you recommend certain tools for budgeting?
I mean, there's lots, and we've seen really good quality budgeting happening on something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, all the way up to really detailed things, right? I mean, it doesn't have, like I said earlier, it doesn't have to be overcomplicated. It doesn't have to take a long time. It's just a matter of looking at the right information.
Yeah, so there's not really the best practice there, and I agree with you. I always say, especially when you look at strategies and stuff for our industry, people always get scared of the word strategy. It's not a very exciting word, and they always get scared. And I was like, you know what, you can use a napkin. I don't really care as long as you have a plan.
Yeah,
and something. Sure. And I think the same thing with budgeting is that as long as you have something in place and you're doing those things, you're going to see corrections and stuff like that along the way. And I love the fact that you recommend like a monthly and a fluid. What happens when you go under a budget? Is there anything you recommend there?
When you underperform
over it, that's easy. But what happens when a restaurant goes under budget? Is there a concern?
Yeah, and this is, I think where some of the biggest opportunity lies for operators in our industry is really, working on being able to identify very quickly what caused that underperformance. And typically, what we're finding happening. What's that?
Sorry, did you call that underperformance then?
Yeah,
that's really cool.
Well, compared to budget, right? I mean, it would be underperforming. So typically, the number one driver that we see in terms of underperformance is related to customer count, typically.
Okay.
So, a lot of restaurants, and I was guilty of this when I was still in operations at some points too, is we write budgets, like I said earlier, based on top line revenue and then everything in relation to that. Right. But if we aren't considering what's happening with seasonality, with customer behavior, with promotions, with all of those things, and what it does to ultimately to the customer count that's coming in, we might actually be losing customers. But because we've adjusted our prices 4 times in the last year, our revenue is up. So we might, we see this often where restaurants are still writing schedules and purchasing goods based on the customer count that they used to have. And now they're actually losing money because of that. They're overscheduling, they're over purchasing, and they're leaving money on the table because they're not looking at it from a customer count perspective. Wow. They're just thinking about it in terms of total revenue and what do I need to buy.
What do you need to buy, right? Wow. And that happens all the time.
All the time. Yeah.
Man, that's crazy.
Customer count and customer behavior are the number one and number 2 drivers of almost everything that can be every problem that exists in a restaurant.
Wow.
That's our advice.
No, but that's really good advice, Jim. You made me, here we go once again, just what Jim does. He always makes you think differently. And I just don't hear people saying that. I've never heard people say that on a show like this. So thank you, Jim. Like you really, really make us think in a different way. And I appreciate that.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I was a huge fan of what you do and stuff. So awesome. So everyone else, we're going to wrap up right here. Jim, any last comments or words before we go?
Just that, what we were talking about earlier, if you don't have some sort of budget going, just get something started. And, it's better to plan than be reactive and have to struggle your way through it. So cost of goods and labor are always the first 2 to start with and then work from there.
And if you need Jim's help, you can go to benchmark60.com, check it out. There's a contact information's right there, right, Jim?
Yeah, absolutely.
So check it out. Like I said, read all the stuff. Wicked website, by the way. And find out more about what Jim can do to help you as well. And Jim, I just can't thank you enough. And to everyone else, we are live from Ottawa. Look at Jim, I got my notes here. I just didn't happen last year, people. So we are live from Ottawa next week. On next Tuesday, I'll be interviewing a whole bunch of restaurateurs, chefs, tech people, you name it. Chris from App 8 is going to join me as my co-host for that day. And then we're going to go and do some fun content creation that week with restaurants and stuff like that in Ottawa. So then the following week, we're live from Terroir in Calgary, which Jim can't be there. Wish we could see him there. But we're going to be there from Sunday all the way till Wednesday, and we're going to be live streaming the event. So if you can't go to Terroir, Jim, you can sit and watch it on Sysco Canada's YouTube page.
I'll watch it.
Absolutely. Yeah, we'll have every show, every speaker on there. And then to remind everyone that we're daily, 3 p.m. Eastern, Monday to Friday. You can go and check us. You can actually binge watch if you want on Sysco Canada's YouTube page. We've got tons of shows, over 300 shows on there that we've done over the last 2 years. This is our 3rd year. So we're going to bring you 296 more shows. 96, I think, Jim. We have to go 296 to go for the rest of the year. And then also, I recommend, if you haven't subscribed, first of all, but go to Sysco.ca for tons of great information they have over there. They have great stuff on there, great articles, great information about different partners that we have within our badge program as well. So go check that out, and then we will see you next week. And Jim, I cannot thank you enough. First of all, doing what you do for the industry, but also the way that you make us think differently. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Jay.
You bet. For everyone else, have a great rest of your day and get out there and spend some money in the restaurants. And I know. Cheers.